Thank you all so much for coming. And I especially want to thank the members of the Women's History Institute Founding Committee who are here and who are online. The Women's History Institute Founding Committee guides all of the work of the Women's History Institute, whether it's choosing our research fellows who come every summer and dive into our collections, finding the most remarkable stories of the women of our region, or whether it's guiding us as we develop public programs or apply for federal and private funding. We've gotten a few big grants this year, so we really feel we're on our way. But I'd say that one of the key programs and one of the ones that we're the most proud of is the Carol Plunkett Conversation and the chance to engage with historians and practitioners who are really shaping how we understand the history of women across the United States and the world, but particularly in this region. And that's why I'm so thrilled that Danielle Dreilinger could be with us today. She is from Chappaqua, so she's a native of the area and familiar with how Westchester ticks. And in fact, in our first conversation, she said she was a fan of Walter's hot dogs, which is in my hometown. So
we went yesterday.
An immediate fan of me. And I have to say, it was so exciting when she accepted our invitation to come and speak about the secret history of home economics, because this is an extraordinary book. And if you haven't read it, I urge you to buy a copy and ask Danielle to sign it after this program, because it is so rich with stories and gossip and a history of America that you knew was happening alongside the history that we all learned in class, but that you may not have really understood. And after reading this book, I think the past 100 years of American history are revealed to you in a way that you couldn't have imagined, and yet it seems so obvious, right? Of course, this is how things transpired, and these are the women who are behind it all. So I'm going to just give you a little brief introduction as to who Danielle is, if you don't already know, and then we'll dive into our conversation and leave plenty of time for questions with all of you and with the folks who are on Zoom. So I always feel strange saying this in front of the person who is, it's your biography, so I'm describing you to yourself. But Danielle Dreilinger is a journalist. This is her first book, but she has been an accomplished practitioner in the field of journalism for decades. She was a 2018 Knight Wallace Journalism Fellow at University of Michigan. She was named the best feature writer by the Louisiana Press Association, and she's received fellowships for this project and others from the Robert B. Silvers Foundation, the Education Writers Association, and the Institute for Citizens and Scholars, which I didn't know was the new name of the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, which is very interesting. And we could have a whole nother conversation just about that. She spent 5 years covering New Orleans' education revolution, which is something I've certainly heard New Orleanian friends describe, for the Times-Picayune, which, as we all know, is the paper of record for New Orleans. And before that, she was in Boston producing WGBH's local news website and also writing for the Boston Globe, most notably as their Somerville correspondent, focusing on gentrification, diversity, and city life. Of course, Somerville is really at the crux of all of those issues. She's also worked for WBUR, so she's covered all my favorite institutions, and where she was part of the team that won that station's first online journalism award. And you can find her writing in the New York Times, the USA Today, the Atlantic, and soon in Bon Appetit, as we were just discussing. This book, which again, I hope you will purchase because it is thoroughly engrossing, and you're going to be quoting it to people until they ask you to stop. It was hailed by the New Yorker as a deeply researched and crisply written book when it was published just last year, and the Wall Street Journal called it a captivating debut. I think the fact that those two publications could agree on this is remarkable. I'd like to add that it's also a very exciting story. It's as complicated and tempestuous as a novel. It's funny, it's shocking, it's inspiring. And because it's written chronologically, because it tells a story of the history of this field from its beginnings to the present day, our conversation will, to some degree, also be chronological, but I reserve the right to meander so that Danielle can share with us some of the surprising innovations in the field and some of the preoccupations that mark its history. So welcome. Thank you so much for coming. And I'd like to start by asking you the really obvious question, which is what brought you to this study?
Right. Well, thank you also so much for having me. Sure. And it's especially meaningful for me to be here because, when I look back at like signs from my past that this was a book that I was going to write, when I was growing up, we had field trips to the historic Hudson Valley sites in school, of course. And there was one, I can't remember if it was at Van Cortlandt Manor or Phillipsburg Manor, where I was in 4th grade and we were spending the entire day, and we had the opportunity to, do the work of one part of the manor for the day. And I dressed up. It was like, cosplay before cosplay was cool.
Very nice.
And I immediately jumped at being in the kitchen. And so I spent the whole day in the subterranean kitchen with this, open hearth, when we all cooked on the fire.
Very nice. So we can claim some credit for the work. Okay, got it.
So,
so
the way that I came to write this book is a funny story in that, well, my mother, who is here, was in fact a business home economist, but I completely forgot. I forgot until I was 6 months into the project, at which point I was like, dear self, right. But I had no idea. Most journalists come across book ideas while they are working on stories for a publication, and they come across something that's so amazing that they just have to take it farther. This was not that at all. I was a finalist for the Knight Wallace Fellowship. I wanted to use the time to write a book. And so I was thinking about what sort of book I wanted to write, because I had had one idea, I hadn't liked it enough. I wanted it to concern education because I'd been covering education. I wanted it to have to do with history because I love to read history. It had to support a book, right? It had to be something that hadn't been written before. I wanted it to be about race, gender, and class, because it felt like otherwise it just wouldn't be relevant. And then the secret ingredient, so to speak, was that when I was interviewing for this fellowship, they said, oh, the University of Michigan has this amazing culinary collection in the library. And I could just see myself light up. And I thought, oh, dear self, hold on to that. I thought, I cook a lot. I read about food. I, spend really most of my time thinking about food. And I also, I knit, and into the things that I thought home economics was about that turned out to not entirely be that.
Right.
And I thought, well, I hear writing a book is hard work. I should make sure that something I enjoy doing in my own time is part of it as well. So I truly just put all of that in the hopper and went about my business. And a few weeks later, I was like, home economics. Like, there we go. It's the class that used to teach girls how to cook, like everything covered. And I immediately thought, like, well, geez, why isn't that back by now? It seemed to so many trends this is 2016. So many trends in our society seem to be pointing towards home economics, everything from Project Runway and the Food Network to the resurgence of career technical education, the fear about like adulting. Shouldn't it be back by now? And then when I actually started to do research into it, I learned that one of the founders of home economics was the first woman to go to MIT. And so I just immediately knew that there was so much more to this than I knew, than anybody knew. Like MIT, and she was a chemist, it wasn't like MIT had a home economics wing.
Right.
So, and that's how it got started. And then I spent the next few years as I was writing it, terrified that somebody else was going to come up with this great book idea before I did.
And so you must have been surprised then when you were researching Ellen Swallow Richards, the woman who went to MIT, to discover that she would have been horrified at your idea that it was about cooking, that it was the class that taught women to cook. Can you say a little bit about her? Because I found her to be an astonishing character.
She really was. So, well, let me just start with the premise of the book. And this is what I discovered, is that this field that we think of as being about housewives, being in the kitchen barefoot and pregnant, and repression and the feminine mystique, started off as a field for career women that was created so that women could spend less time in taking care of their homes, more time doing what they wanted to do, whether that be work or had to do, right? Whether that be working for wages, getting education, taking care of their children, being involved in civic life, and also to create a whole range of careers where women would be accepted because these careers were tied, however tangentially, to jobs that they were doing in the home. So, you know, hotel management, nutrition, school cafeteria managers, and so on. But, you know, the whole time they knew perfectly well that they were pushing against these stereotypes about the work of the home. So in a way, I'm not sure, I think Ellen Swallow Richards would have been disappointed that it was about cooking class for girls, but she wouldn't have been surprised because she was pushing against that as well. So she was born in the 1840s. She was born in Massachusetts, and she must have just been a remarkably smart, like an obviously smart child. She was a kid who, her parents were both educated more than, this is a time when like most people didn't go to school. Most white people didn't go to school. Anyone who was enslaved, of course, couldn't go to school. But you know, people, and what they meant by going to school could be as little as like 4 months in a year. But she, her parents moved town so that she could go to one of the few high schools for girls at the time. She was taking care of her dad's shop at the same time, and she would read when she was walking across the green to go to school. So she was just hungry for knowledge. And afterwards, you know, there weren't many women's colleges, but she managed eventually to go to Vassar just as it was starting. And she fell in love with science and chemistry, and she wanted to be a chemist. And, you know, her whole story was a story of just like there was no way, but she made a way. So she, even though MIT was brand new, didn't accept women, there were no schools that accepted women for postgraduate science work. But she applied to MIT, and, you know, it turns out the president believed in coeducation, and he took her, and she was the first woman to go, the first woman to graduate, the first woman to teach there, though they wouldn't call her a professor. And they didn't pay her for a while either. And after a number of years of doing public health work, she was, the superintendent of schools for Boston came to watch her work and said, you know, meaning to insult her, like, oh, well, what good will this do women in the kitchen? But she thought, you know, geez, this is a good question. Like, what good will this do women in the kitchen? And she saw this way that science could be brought into the home and teach women to lead more healthful lives that were more efficient, so that they wouldn't get exploited by people, you know, by salespeople. Like they would know when they were sold cream of tartar, whether it was good, for instance. And she helped this was one of the arms of the home economics movement that she is, if anybody, people in the field today, before my book came out, if they knew about anybody at the Center of Home Economics, they knew about Ellen Richards.
That's so interesting, because I think she's one of the hardest to categorize, because as you describe her, and her story is woven throughout the book, she's responsible for so many different innovations, and they don't all add up to the simple soundbite.
Right.
So for example, in the New England kitchen, which was this experiment in inexpensive takeout for, you know, we're talking about after the Civil War. So it's kind of building on the sanitary kitchens of the Civil War, but offering something, you know, very different. And then the Aladdin oven. Can you talk about the Aladdin oven?
Oh yeah, so it was essentially a crock pot. So
in 1893.
1890s, yes. So she found this man who had developed a fireless cooker, and it was a slow cooker, so you could heat things, and it worked exactly the way a crock pot, set it down and go and do your other things. And she thought that this had this remarkable promise, and she devised all of these meals around the slow cooker, the Aladdin oven, because she knew that long, slow cooking could break down tough cuts of meat, the cheap things, right? And that would help people who didn't have much money. And she saw as, the prospects for institutional cooking. And at the same time, actually, Booker T. Washington, I tried really hard to see if they met, and I could not find any evidence that they did. I put them at the same conference, but they were speaking at different days. But he discovered this and was interested in its possibilities at Tuskegee, where we'll probably be talking about his wife was running a home economics program there, and as a way to serve the cafeteria.
Mm-hmm. I think it's so interesting, because you think about home economics, and as you began by saying, for you, it was about your own interest in cooking and knitting and some of these kind of arts of the hand that we actually very much associate with visits to Phillipsburg Manor, Van Cortlandt Manor. But at the same time, for so many of the women, particularly in the first wave of home economics, it was about labor-saving devices that were very much at the cutting edge, that would be on display at the World's Fair, that would be adopted by the brand new Tuskegee Institute. And that really runs counter to the way we think about home economics. We think about, you learn how to hold an egg for a week to demonstrate your parenting technique, or a sack of flour, or whatever it might be, but not all of these innovations, which seem much more contemporary and almost kind of Jetsons-like. Yes. Can you talk a little bit about Margaret Murray Washington? She also really surprised me.
Yeah, Margaret Murray Washington, a woman who deserves to be on a postage stamp. She was the most amazing discovery that I made. So she was born about, I guess it was, a generation after Ellen Richards. And she was born in the 1860s. She was born in Mississippi. She lied about her age in a couple of different ways. So it's not clear whether she was born during the Civil War or just after. The story that she always told, though no one has ever been able to pin it down, is that her father was an Irish railroad man. Her mother was a laundry worker, a Black laundry worker in Mississippi. And, when I think about Ellen and how there was no way, but she made a way, you take Margaret and just multiply it by 10. And she was taken under the wing of a Quaker brother and sister who had moved down to Mississippi to help educate freed people after the war. And they helped teach her, and then they sent her to Fisk in Nashville, which is, an incredibly long way back before, interstate highways and car travel. And she then lived in Fisk. She worked her way through Fisk Institute, and she earned a bachelor's degree in English and was all ready to take a job in Texas, a college teaching job, when on her graduation day, Booker T. Washington came from Tuskegee to meet the graduates. And by the time that dinner was over, she had a job working for him at Tuskegee instead. And she was the Dean of Women, but actually English professor, Dean of Women, but she rapidly came to embrace his idea of vocational education as being meaningful and valuable. And he said that there is as much, I'm paraphrasing, there is as much value in tilling a field as there is in writing a poem. And she took that on, and she also so Black colleges were the first colleges to have home economics coursework, followed a year or two later by land-grant universities in the West, aka the Midwest. And it was only later followed by the Northeast to New England schools. And she believed, she looked at what Tuskegee was doing for the farmers, and she said, we need to do something for the farmers' wives, for Black farmers' wives. We need to teach them how to keep a good home. They have been, these were sharecroppers. They were living in slave shanties. And she, along with, training women students at Tuskegee to have jobs in home, in various home economics fields, such as, millinery and dressmaking. She saw home economics as a way to create moral leaders for their communities. And it was very, again, if home economics as a whole was pushing against this idea of home labor as being like women's work and being kind of, demeaning, she was pushing against, Black women having being relegated to jobs as house cleaners and cooks in white people's homes. And she was saying, no, this is a way to be economically independent. This is a way to be a leader in your community. And also then she did all this community education for women in the community to help just teach them practical ways, low cost ways, no cost ways to make their homes nicer and to raise their children so that they would have self-respect, which she believed would also lead to political power. But even if it didn't, self-respect would be a political statement in and of itself.
Yeah, she, like her husband, I think their views were controversial for some Black academics, and
absolutely,
because it was about uplift, and they made a correlation between moral uplift and the state of your home in her case, or the work of your hands. And it's interesting to see the ways in which she navigates some of that. She was she could be a little bit moralizing.
Oh, yes.
And some of her, but you can also see the ways in which she's working toward creating a Black middle class at a time when such a thing, was just beginning to come into existence.
Right. And she herself, I mean, he was one of the most famous Black men in America, and she was just as famous.
Wife, right.
Yeah. So his first two wives died young, and they got married a few years after she came to Tuskegee. But I mean, she met the Queen of England. She was incredibly famous. When she died, the president sent a telegram, and the fact that she had just been completely forgotten is, a sad thing.
It is, and also because she was the first to really kind of to have sort of a diasporic approach to this,
right.
So that she was part of, what was it, the Pan-African work that she did after World War II. I thought was so interesting. World War I, excuse me. It was so interesting because I think it was new for Americans to think about Africa, to think about, especially Black Americans, to think of them in relationship to Africa, and then in sort of a post-Liberian moment.
Mm-hmm.
And then her work does anticipate the work of Flemmie Cottrell, which we won't talk about yet. But but I do think it's fascinating to see how she kind of had the same platform in a different institution as Ellen Richards. I mean, you talk, and this was news for me, the ways in which the rise of the Seven Sisters and the rise of the HBCUs were both products of kind of a post-Civil War moment. Right. And so they were both creating opportunities for Americans who previously had not been given any opportunity.
Also technical, like scientific schools as well, like MIT as well, like that they didn't exist before the Civil War either. And the land-grant colleges, educate, basically this huge expansion in college education, going way beyond this elite of, like the Harvard curriculum.
Do you think that home economics would have been possible without that?
No, I don't actually. And in part because so much of home economics, it centered so strongly on college education. And they, at the sort of official founding conference of home economics, or where they just sort of codified and redefined the fledgling movement, they specifically changed the name from domestic economy, domestic science, which is what it had been called up to then, to home economics, in a bid to make it sound collegiate.
So interesting. I actually wanted to talk about the Lake Placid Club and the American Home Economics Association. One of the things that Danielle's book does so brilliantly is to kind of let you into the politics of these groups as they were forming their identity. And it's really fascinating because the personalities who are literally at the table in some cases, or on the dais, are people that you've heard of in other contexts, and you're getting a very different glimpse into their world. So first Booker T. Washington, but now the Deweys, of course.
Well, Melville, I mean, nobody knows who Melville Dewey's wife is, right?
Do you all know who Melville Dewey is?
The Dewey Decimal System guy.
Oh, right.
Dewey Decimal
that
System,
helps,
yes.
I know.
The Dewey Decimal System. So the Dewey Decimal System guy was a key force in the founding of home economics, for good and bad, because he was, oh man. So, I mean, I think we can, to use an anachronism, he has been incredibly canceled, and he could not have deserved it more.
Yes.
And he was, no, I mean, so he and his wife were very interesting and very problematic people. They were librarians. They met as librarians. Annie was she was the first head librarian for, I think it was Wellesley. And they got married, and they were very strict and religious, and they founded this, and Annie discovered home economics and just met Ellen Swallow Richards because they opened this resort up in Lake Placid, and she wanted it to be like the most healthful place with this, latest domestic science principles. And she wrote Ellen to be basically her consultant and help her get the project going, because she found that it was very difficult to try to have a domestic science oriented resort when a whole lot of the guests didn't know, like the big thing that she mentioned, they want their beds made up directly while they're at breakfast, but we should be airing the beds for health. So how am I supposed to figure out housekeeping?
I'm going to use that next time I don't want to make the bed. I'm just
Right, you're
airing my bed.
You're airing your bed.
It's healthful.
It's helpful. But the thing is, and so she is the one who made this Lake Placid convention, 10 years of conferences happen. And Melville was sort of the MC because he was a very ebullient, jovial man.
I'm very well connected.
And very well connected, right. They were both he was the state librarian of New York at the time. He had been the head of the Columbia Library School. He had been the one to admit women into it. And they just saw this as like another form of this progressive activism along with simplified spelling. They were kind of kooks, which is why it's Melville, Melville. But the problem with all of this is that they were also both really horrible. So Melville got fired from or forced to resign, but one of the other, in 1905 and 1906, and from his state job, and simultaneously booted from the American Library Association, which he had helped found. The ALA was because he was sexually harassing women. And this was, I mean, again, it's like, this has to be, gotta be pretty bad to get in trouble for this in 1905, right? But it was documented that he was sexually harassing women. And at the same time, the Lake Placid Resort, one of the things I was looking at, I was like, why is this like all these people, why are all these people white? Like, why is this an entirely white affair?
Anglo-Saxon white too, we should say.
Right. And it was because the resort was segregated. It was no blacks and no Jews. And the various powerful Jewish men in New York brought this up with, found out that the resort was anti-Semitic, and they, started wondering why it was that he was spending all this time there when he was supposedly working in Albany. And, they put pressure on it, and he, had to leave his job while claiming that he actually wrote somewhere that some of his best friends were Jews. So, and they were both also, as the years went on, increasingly involved in eugenics.
Yeah.
So, it is a real problem with that part of the early home economics movement, that they were in bed with, these eugenicists.
But I think it's so interesting too, because the home economics movement always seems to reflect the zeitgeist. So after the Civil War, the further expansion of education, and then in the leading up to the progressive era, that kind of 1-2 punch of progressivism and eugenics, the home economics, the camp is always in there. And so you can, if you're supporting their work, you can find the people who are kind of on the right side, and then you can certainly find the people whose views are problematic.
Absolutely. You can find you can find the people who are expressing like incredibly feminist views in the 1920s. Right. You can find the people who are championing immigrants. You can find the people who are writing that immigrants are like a second, third class of citizens.
That we shouldn't let the New York children have pickles in their lunch, because it's an ethnic food. So yeah, it's I think that what struck me is, while the drama is happening around places like the Lake Placid Club, home economists are quietly taking over. So and it seems to be very kind of neatly tied to the world wars, and that both world wars provided these remarkable opportunities for home economists, particularly for women, to rise up and take very important positions. And so you talk about the ways in which food became an issue in World War I. So the American Dietetic Association was founded by a home economist at the time when home ec was the only vocational subject that was recognized for women by the federal government. And also that there then grew to be, in the wake of World War I, this kind of cult of the home ec show and the electric circus. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about some of the publicity kind of engine of home ec that started to grow in that time period, kind of between the world wars.
Right. So yeah, so World War I was this catalyzing public moment for home economics because all of a sudden people were worried about saving so that they could send wheat to the front, and home economists just sort of jumped up and did all sorts of community education to help people, like to develop like recipes for wheatless breads. It's always funny to look at some of this stuff and I think it's like, you know, gluten-free
Yes.
breads today in 1919.
Yes.
And then after that, you know, they really rode this wave in the 1920s that, yeah, also reflected a bunch of the 1920s activity in many ways. So they jumped, the government, having relied on home economists in World War I, created the Bureau of Home Economics in USDA. They hired a woman named Louise Stanley, who was at the time the highest ranked woman in the executive branch. She hired the largest employer of women scientists in the country. And they worked on all sorts of projects. There was, you know, from creating sewing patterns that would help for children's clothes that kids could put on themselves to promote independence, to promoting recipes to promote various like USDA commodities that they had a surplus of at the time, to doing time use studies. So they were the first people. This is one of the things I think is so valuable about home economics, is they were like really the first to talk about the value of women's time, of, you know, with a time that, you know, not being paid wages, but looking at how women spent their time and showing the contributions that made to the economy. And at the same time, they jumped on radio, which was the big new technology of the 1920s. So all of a sudden, you have this slew of homemaker radio shows, in part because they recognized that women were home
Listening to the
radio. And and you can work while you're listening to the radio. You don't have to sit down and use your eyes. So they had, this was the start of Betty Crocker. Betty Crocker was just a few years old, and she had this cooking show.
We should say.
The collective. There
Yes.
was no Betty Crocker. There was not a single person named Betty Crocker.
But nobody would admit that. You said no one would admit there was no Betty Crocker.
Right. And it's not like, this is not like Rachel Ray. Like, we know that Rachel Ray is a team of people, but like there is a person.
There is a Rachel Ray.
There was no Betty Crocker.
Yeah.
She was a home economics department that eventually numbered something like 40 people. And yeah, you had universities, you know, doing community programs. You had all sorts of radio homemakers who were the shelter bloggers, basically, of their day, talking, you know, doing these like just folksy shows, talking about their homes and what cakes they were baking. And, you know, they were paid, you know, they were paid career women who got jobs in radio.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So yeah, it was, and the Bureau of Home Economics invented Aunt Sammy, and that was Uncle Sam's sister. And she had all sorts of efficient homemaking advice. And they wrote all these radio scripts for her. And she was not a homemaker. She was a professional. And she could be very sassy. She had some really catty things to say about somebody who wanted to diet.
That's right.
Yeah.
Was she the one who said you shouldn't wear plaid?
Oh, no, that was Margaret Murray Washington's book. Okay. Said that plaids made women stout women look more stout.
Yeah. So there's definitely that critical line running through this. And around the same time, I was so pleasantly surprised to see you mention Laura Spelman Rockefeller. Of course, she's very important to us at Historic Hudson Valley. And you talked about her investment in child development, because parenting had not until this point been part of the story of home economics. And it was really her investment and others that kind of brought child development into the larger picture of home ec. And from that, you went on to talk about the practice babies.
Right.
And I had asked you if you wouldn't mind talking about that a little bit now, because
give a little bit of framework for people.
Please do.
It was so crazy to me to realize that. So Laura Spelman Rockefeller, she funded child development research and education at a number of universities. And she, I was like, wait a second, is this really the start of child development? Like, I must have missed it in the earlier stuff, right? And I went back and I like reread the, model syllabi. I was like, no, there's no childcare in this at all. But in the 1920s, because they got funding from a foundation. So they did that. Anyone who works in nonprofits or education will know, great, they did it. And they came up with this university, so they had already started something in universities and occasionally in high schools called the home management house or the practice house, practice apartment, which was this, the first one I could find was now Atlanta University. And it was this, lab, like a home lab. So students, usually seniors, would, go in and they would live in the home management house for maybe 6 weeks, maybe up to a semester, and they would take care of the home. And this would be like an advanced class to integrate things that they had learned. And this is fascinating in and of itself because it looks very domestic, but as scholars have pointed out, like it wasn't actually like a nuclear family in the slightest, right? It was like a feminist commune, basically. It was a whole bunch of women living, taking care of this house together. And so what is this house missing, right? Children. There's no children. So they decided, Cornell was one of the first, right? What we need in the practice house is a practice baby. And that is what they did. And so this is a real, actual child.
Not a sack of flour, not an egg.
Right. So I'm going to sort of skip around a bit. Part of the first practice baby at Cornell named Dickie Domicon for domestic economy. They all got that last name. We have had much pleasure this spring and summer in feeding our practice house baby, Director Flora Rose wrote. His flesh is firm and pink, and his eyes a brilliant blue. For a common or garden baby, we all think him quite remarkable. Like Dickie Domicon, home economics practice babies typically came from adoption agencies or orphanages, though occasionally they were loaned directly by families whose mother was unwell or father working far away. Upper-class students lived in the practice home for some portion of a semester and rotated in as baby manager for a couple of weeks each, planning and carrying out the baby's meals, naps, baths, playtime, and discipline, and so on, all under faculty supervision. Practice babies lived on campus for anywhere from a semester to a year, at which point they were made available for adoption. Students often made scrapbooks to remember the babies by. They had plenty of newspaper clippings to include because press coverage was extensive and sickeningly coy. Journalists dwelled on the inevitably bouncing charges, newly chubby cheeks, and sparkling big eyes, and made tiresome jokes. If baby Catherine Marie gets from under the cover some cold night and takes cold, a co-ed will receive a demerit mark, the Boston Globe warned. Babies ready to be adopted were said to be graduating. Amid so much literary drool, it's really quite a relief to read a note in a Cornell student paper that mourned Dickie Domicon's departure, with a few tears from our editorial fountain pen as the source of much freak news for this neighborly journal.
It's just extraordinary. All of these practice babies and that was considered to be perfectly acceptable extension to the home economics curriculum.
Right. And I mean, and even if this was admired, there were 24 families ready to adopt each practice baby because they were saying, well, these have been raised as like the best scientifically approved methods of child rearing. And, not said in that was the fact that, if the alternative was a child who had been in an orphanage for a year, I mean, this like flipped the care ratio around, right? You had, instead of a whole lot of children who weren't getting very much attention from a few staff members, you had this baby who had just been, cuddled and fed and attended to. And so, probably much better socialized and much more healthy.
Right. than your average garden variety baby.
Than your average
Right,
garden
right, right.
variety baby.
But then, of course, the flip side of this, what you do talk about, is that the practice houses were segregated.
Yes.
And so not this opportunity, as weird as it strikes us today, was not open to every undergraduate.
Well, so, and the practice houses were segregated in the undergraduate institutions that were integrated in the first place.
Mhm.
So that is only a few, but yes, there was a there was a woman who sued in the Midwest, a Black woman, to be allowed to live in the practice apartment with the practice baby because it was student housing, and student housing on that campus was segregated. And she lost her lawsuit, but it was fascinating to see the voices for support and the voices against. And actually then, I think it was Jesse Owens chose that college to sign on to. And the Black papers were horrified. They're like, how could he go to this place that's just been in the news 6 months ago for, not letting this, Cleveland socialite studying home economics live in the practice house?
I think what's so striking about thinking about practice houses and about the kind of best baby that they promote is that it's in opposition to work that other domestic economists were doing at this time to really bring awareness to the cultural practices of Indigenous people, of Mexican Americans, and of Black Southern Americans, and to try and elevate their own traditions and kind of and veer a little bit away from this idea of the uniform best baby, the uniform best food, and all these other strides that the field was making. There's a kind of shift that you perceive around this time with people like Flemmy, for example, Flemmy Pansy Cottrell, who I hope you can talk briefly about. I know the problem with them, there's so many people that I'd love to talk about all of them, but there are a number of characters whom you meet in Danielle's book who are really kind of beating against the tide of what could be seen as a sort of progressive movement toward a unified vision of betterment, which is very white and very middle class, and which is trying to streamline out any kind of ethnic associations, any ethnic foods, or any kind of cultural mores that are considered to be un-American at this time. But then there are individuals who are working against that in very meaningful ways.
Right. So yeah, the mainstream of home economics, certainly until the early 60s, and the war on poverty was very much focused on this is the best way to do things. But you had these you had home economists of color who were working against that. So Flemmy Cottrell, who grew up right near where I live now, and I am going to give a talk about her at the library in her hometown soon, which is very exciting. She was interested in political science, and she went to Hampton, and this was when Hampton still had a high school. So she went to the high school, and then she went to the college. And it was not all that many years after the death of Ellen Richards, maybe about 10 years. And someone gave her a copy of the biography, the biography. And she was really inspired by that, and inspired about ways to use the home as a tool for political change. So she went and taught, she became a dean of home economics, and began pursuing graduate education at Cornell during the summers while she was working as a professor in the South in what we would now call an HBCU. So she did that for many years, and then it was after World War II that she really hit her stride. She really broke out. She got one of the first Fulbrights for a home economist. And before that, actually, she had a State Department trip. So one of the things that happens in home economics that's really exciting after World War II is it becomes part of this global anti-communist soft power / global improvement project. And they start sending home economists all over the world to help other countries do the same thing that they had done in the US. And she went to Liberia and she conducted the first full-scale nutritional survey of a country. And she was the first to calculate the caloric values of things like collard greens and just the traditional Iberian diet, and put it on the same platform as the Anglo diet that had been traditionally taught in home economics schools. She went to India. She helped women start colleges there, and she relied on local experts. She was a scientist. She was this world traveler. She helped design the home economics building at Howard. She took the deanship of home economics in Howard on the condition that they would build her a new building. And so she helped design this building to pay homage to various countries in Africa and African traditions. And she brought some art back to put on the walls. She had one area that was designed like a traditional, I forget which country, but like a traditional homestead there. And she just, she saw herself as the citizen of the world.
Her story is
also, she helped found Head Start, like in her spare time. She helped out Head Start.
That was so surprising because you first Head Start is in 1964, I believe.
63, 64, I'm not sure.
And at that point, she's dropped out of Danielle's story because it's been a couple decades, and then all of these characters who are players, and as you'll see when you read it, come back, and Head Start becomes kind of the renaissance of some of the key players from earlier in the century. And it is really fascinating to see throughout this book the ways in which the movers and shakers, there's a kind of genealogy that transcends upbringing, it transcends race and class, but they're working toward this common purpose. With some missteps along the way, as we've said, but it's much more inspiring than I expected. I had to take home ec in 7th grade, and I made a pair of shorts which fell apart the first time I wore them, and that was the extent of my home ec knowledge, and I felt pretty good about that.
I made a frozen banana.
Good for you.
It was a stuffed animal. It was blue, and it had, like, you put the peel down, he's blue, and he was shivering.
You actually made something that you could pull the peel down. So much superior to
it was the most advanced stuffed animal project that they offered. But then I brought it home on the school bus in 8th grade.
Oh,
yeah, that was not good.
We won't even. And we haven't even talked about space food, but I'm mindful that, I think I could.
We can leave something for them to read.
I know. And I want to ask if there are questions from the audience, and I'll ask more questions of Danielle if there are none, but if there are any questions from the audience or on Zoom, I just want to give people a chance to speak too, so it's not just the two of us up here having a grand old time.
Well,
yes, please.
Comment. I am so happy that you have talked about practice babies because my mother was a home economics major at the University of Tennessee and lived in a practice baby.
Oh,
not an easy
told us about the practice baby, and we kind of didn't believe it. It was so shocking. I mean, because wow.
Really? Yes.
Right.
Yeah. Really.
So I will write to that part in the book, but. And the funny thing that she would say was, oh yeah, so that in that, 3 weeks we did the practice baby, and then he'd move on to drapes or something.
Yeah.
Wow, that's head spinning.
Yeah, no, it really is. And I had an actual baby that.
I did want to follow up with the bananas and the shift. I made a shift in my home class. So how did it trickle down to what some of us at a certain age, knew as our high school or middle school, junior high home ec class? How did that happen?
So the short version, I'm glad you asked. So that was the hardest question for me to answer. And that I felt like the biggest question that I had to answer. And that's why the chapter that was supposed to be one chapter about the 1950s turned into 4 chapters. The short version is that there were, as we all know, enormous forces after World War II that were pushing women out of the workplace, that were pushing this vision of what a woman's life should be. And a lot of the home economists were not paying attention because they were off around the world. They thought that they had solved the problems of the US. They were, when the war against poverty started, they were really horrified at how wrong they had been. So they were, and they had been pushing up against sexist backlash the whole way. So I think they didn't recognize that this was different. You had the fact that K-12 home economics was always mushier than college, because that's, in the college departments, that was a place where women were in charge. And K-12, that's not, I mean, even though women were many of the teachers, men were in charge. Like the men were the superintendents, were on the school boards and so on. And to top it all off, you had the arms race and the Cold War and this focus on hard sciences and math and what we have to do to beat the Reds. And although home economics had started off as this very scientific field, the people who were leaders at that time, for whatever reason, were much more interested in emphasizing how it was important to be a whole person, as opposed to saying, no, we're science too, we're applied science, we're a way for kids to learn science. So they just got systematically defunded. The Bureau of Home Economics was turned into the Bureau of Human Nutrition and Home Economics. And it was by the early 60s, it was gone altogether. So I think, which also, I mean, there were, even there, there are all sorts of things that male deans, college presidents said that they just thought home economics was stupid. So that is the combination, I think, of forces that were really pushing it. And there's more as well. There was a whole new wave of child development curriculum that was created mostly Dr. Spock, and it was very mother does this, mother does that.
Yeah. And then there was this home economics was accused of being perpetuating secular humanism.
That was the 80s.
Eastern religion.
That was the 80s when it was perpetually secular humanism.
Yeah. Another question? Yeah.
So I think about home ec, and I recall I only attended public school for 2 years, and the only thing I remember about public school was the god-awful home economics class. But I also remember shop class.
Yes.
Right. So I'm wondering, was home economics a field, and then the corollary for boys was created at some point later? Okay.
So I don't know exactly. So shop class was created at the same time as home economics. And there was for a while something, this is one of those weird words that nobody has ever heard of. It's called SLOYD, SLOYD. I don't even, which that was what shop class was originally called. But there was a whole movement, there was, at the end of the 19th century, a whole movement of home economics shop in school. And I will say that shop has had a much more powerful lobby for it. That plus the fact that its careers are better paid. So, there is a reason that welding is getting pushed so much now. But yes, they were, and for years, yes, it was the girls in home ec, boys in shop. And in the funny thing is that Ellen Richards herself believed that everybody should do both.
Yeah.
She actually wrote, it's one of my favorite lines of hers. She says something about, how women should be able to use hand tools so they can be independent, right? She says, when, I'm paraphrasing only very slightly here, when men, and men, they take the tools out of our hands and do the work themselves, not always as we would have it done. Closet shelves are always too high. But thanks to Title IX, it is now illegal to put boys in shop and girls in home ec. Specifically, as in the regulations, they say you can't do that.
Other questions from the audience? Margaret, do you have someone on Zoom?
We do. So we have a question from our Zoom audience that says, what do you think about Martha Stewart? Is she a descendant of home economists?
Great question. And people ask this a lot. No, she was not at all, actually. She was a businesswoman. She was a businesswoman. And so there are still some business home economists left, or people who got their start working in, food companies and utility companies who are still working today, mostly as, consultants. Like I met the former spokeswoman of like the Ohio Egg Board, and they cannot stand her. They also can't stand like they can't stand Giada. Like they can't stand everybody who wastes food when they're scraping out when they're like doing demonstrations. They're like, we learned to scrape the bowl because you don't waste that. So Martha Stewart, she was a caterer. She was fancy. I took the opportunity to acquire a copy of Martha Stewart's Entertaining as book research from a flea market in Alabama.
That's from the 80s?
Yes.
Okay.
And it is, the number of baskets she wants you to have, and it is the opposite of home economics, which, at its core was pragmatic. It was about getting the dinner on the table and getting out of there. And they believed, home economists would have been fine with you hiring a caterer. Like that,
Yes.
That's a job.
Right,
Great.
right.
Why should you spend your time doing that? You have more important things to do. All the fussy stuff that people think is about home economics is very much not what home economics was about.
It's interesting because at the early in the book, you say that for the first wave of home economists, people like, we didn't talk about Catherine Beecher, people like Ellen Richards and Mrs. Washington, drudgery was the word they hated the most. That was what they were trying to avoid, was drudgery. So you outsource your laundry or you outsource your cooking because if you could afford it, because that freed you up for more important things, such as
and they also
working.
believed, yes, in like regulating the working conditions at the laundromat, at the commercial kitchens, to make sure that that was all being produced safely and healthfully, and that people weren't breaking their bodies to do that work.
So then I think what's always strikes me as I read about the many accomplishments of these women is that there's still this tension, and you acknowledge it throughout the book, between the empowerment of women through this practice and their oppression, and the way they always seem to go hand in hand, or one seems to be in the ascendant. And I wonder, when you finished writing it, where you ultimately came out as to home ec, and is it a force for good or not? I've
not settled on that. It oscillates. I've seen both. And when I talk to home economists, I really push the importance of, the best that home economics can be, which is, more or less now it's mostly a high school class, a middle school class, college class. And the fact that it is about both life skills and career skills, the fact that it looks at things you can do, it's the macro and the micro, it's the individual effort, but then the societal change. What needs to, I often bring up, there was a 1951 document the home economist wrote for the military, talking about what needed to happen, what needed to change to employ more mothers in the military industrial complex. And she called for all sorts of big structural changes, including government daycare, daycare for all, because that's what you need to support women and the mothers in the workplace. So I think that it is still very easy. It's still disparaged. It's still looked down upon. It's still an easy class to sort of sail through by people who haven't been trained in what is now called family and consumer sciences, and don't know that, the history, and think that it is about baking brownies or, making canned biscuit, microwave monkey bread. But it can also be, really fascinating, and people can teach things like the life cycle of a cotton t-shirt, and kids love it. Kids really love it. So yeah, I think that it can be a really important, fun force for good. But it can go both ways, and it has.
This has given us a lot to think about. If you haven't read it, please purchase one and have Danielle sign it for you today.
Do we have another question from?
Oh, sorry, was there another question?
We have one more
Great
comment on Zoom that I wanted to share. Margaret O'Neill says, as a home economist, I was thrilled to learn about a variety of disciplines: nutrition and health, food safety, child development, home environment and safety, etc. the 1970s, there was no longer a professional home economics degree, but various areas of study became more specialized: dietetics, human development, food safety, each separate rather than a holistic approach.
Right. That is a good comment. And that's the other thing I should mention. So yes, so you can still study home economics in college. You can also study all of these different disciplines, and
women can study them too.
right.
Not just us,
Yeah.
right?
And you can, different colleges, like like I went to visit Western Michigan University, and the interior design program is part of the family and consumer sciences program. And I've had a lot of conversations with people about like what you gain from having this all still together, which people told me is, that because you can learn interior design, which these days is mostly commercial interior design, like offices and things like that. You can learn that without ever learning anything about cooking or nutrition or child development. But people in the field will say that, when you have to take at least a class or two in these other disciplines, it gives you, you're looking more at how these fields all affect people's lives. So if you're like, okay, financial literacy, part of home economics, you can learn about that from a business and teach it from a business standpoint, and you're going to teach one set of, one curriculum. If you look at it with connection to how you're taking care of your home, how you're feeding yourself, and so on, then you're looking at personal finance as a way to help you, what you need to know to live a better life in full. So I think that's that is what I've heard as being the advantage to still looping together these fields that in many ways are, very separate now.
Sounds like we could all use that home economics class, I think, especially these days as we emerge post-pandemic. Thank you so much for coming to Historic Hudson Valley today. This has been
Thank you for having
really
me.
remarkable. Thank you.